After years of combat missions, things are changing a little for Nebraska's National Guard soldiers. We'll talk about that and other National Guard storylines today on Speaking of Nebraska. Welcome to Speaking of Nebraska. I'm Mike Tobias. Each week through early June, we're here to talk about issues facing our state. We'll also review the just finished legislative session and share a bit of Nebraska history. 9/11 led to a decade of combat deployments for thousands of Nebraska National Guard soldiers with missions to places like Iraq and Afghanistan. That need has slowed in recent years, but our citizen soldiers are still heading overseas, sometimes for very different types of duty. The Nebraska National Guard has perfected event planning since 9/11. Homecomings and farewells for deployed units have been constant. On this Saturday, it's goodbye to about 50 soldiers from the Army Guard's Omaha-based 402nd Military Police Battalion. That same week, the Guard had 3 other events for units deployed abroad.
You know, it used to be when you joined the National Guard, you never got deployed overseas. But of course, since this war on terror has begun, the reverse is true. That if you join the Nebraska National Guard, you expect to be deployed overseas, and yet our young men and women continue to sign up for the Nebraska National Guard because they want to be deployed. They want to go fight this war on terror. They want to take the fight to the enemy.
The 402nd is headed to a different place for a different kind of mission. They'll spend almost a year working at the U.S. military prison at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, a sometimes controversial facility that houses terrorism suspects. It's a support mission. Nebraska soldiers won't have direct contact with prisoners, but they will do a wide range of other things to help keep the prison running.
Our job is really to make sure we're manning the camps in accordance with the force protection standards and also the rules of engagement, and more importantly, the aspects of detainee operations in general. And so when you talk about detainee moves, detainee recreation, certain detainee programs management, that takes so many personnel and so many logistical resources to manage. And our job is really to facilitate that process and making sure those elements are being effective.
There's lots of disciplines involved to running a correctional facility or detainee facility. So everything from, laundry operation, searching, basic life support for the detainees and also for the soldiers, making sure soldiers that are in the mission are getting taken care of.
About a fourth of these soldiers have corrections or law enforcement jobs in the civilian world. Cruikshank is warden of the state penitentiary in Lincoln.
Well, some things won't be different. I mean, security is security, so as far as the detainee ops, making sure that their welfare is, managed appropriately, the protocols, SOPs are being followed, basic life support, all that stuff would be similar, both corrections and the military. What's different in the military is it's a very high-profile facility. The type of inmates that are in that, detainees that are in that facility are different.
Almost half of these soldiers have deployed to other places, including Iraq and Afghanistan. Hunsberger says soldiers will face a different type of non-combat stress in Guantanamo, but they're ready.
Bottom line, we're going to giddy up. We're going to get the job done, and we're going to bring everybody home. Thank you for your time.
Well, let's talk more about deployments, how different units are changing, and challenges for soldiers. And joining us are Air Force Major General Daryl Bohack. He's the Adjutant General of the Nebraska National Guard, and Lieutenant Colonel Jan Bain, who's an Army National Guard Deputy Brigade Commander. Thank you both for joining us. Want to talk a little bit. We just showed some of the going away ceremony for the military security unit that's going to Guantanamo. Talk about, in general, what kind of deployment levels do we have right now? Where are units going?
Sure. So in the Nebraska National Guard, we have about 180 soldiers and airmen currently deployed across the world. And that number will get a little bit smaller as the summer goes on because we'll have some units returning from Iraq and Kuwait. But that's probably going to be a pretty steady state number for a while, a couple hundred gone at any given time.
And this is very different than, a few years ago. In 2010, for example, there was more than 1,000 Army Guard soldiers alone that were deployed overseas, a lot of them in combat missions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, so our other peak year was around 2006, associated with the surge in Iraq when we had almost 1,500 gone, I think, out of the state. And so it really reflects the demands of the various combatant commanders for the United States and their needs and what they require to do their mission. And with the drawdown of forces in Southwest Asia and the Central Command area of operations, we just had lesser requirements to fill.
So let's talk about what this means for the Nebraska National Guard itself. Obviously, there's an upside to not having as many soldiers deployed to dangerous places and not having the impact on families that we see. But is there a downside in terms of recruitment and retention, especially when you had a lot of soldiers that joined in that post-9/11 period for that kind of combat mission?
Well, I think the good thing to say is even the young people joining today still want to go do and be a part of the fight, if you will, but be part of protecting our nation's interests, wherever those might be. So we don't really see a drawdown there. But we had a group of 88 soldiers that deployed as part of the 1st Infantry Division out of Fort Riley, Kansas. Probably 2/3 of that group had never deployed before, and we had more volunteers than requirements. So that, I think, tells us about our ability to deploy. I don't think the lack of deployment opportunities or reduced number of deployment opportunities necessarily affects recruiting, as long as we're developing and delivering demanding and rigorous training opportunities for our soldiers and airmen. That's what keeps them engaged.
Are you close to 100% in terms of the levels that you're budgeted for?
We are. So in the Army National Guard here in Nebraska, we're currently at 95% of authorized strength, and in the Air National Guard, we're at 101%. And our retention is above 85% in the Army and 90% in the Air.
And you've commanded several different units. Is in this kind of post-combat deployment environment, is it harder to stay combat ready?
I think the interest is still there for the soldiers, and it's providing realistic training, trying to create that scenario that's as close to a deployment as possible.
Okay. And, talk a little bit about this Guantanamo Bay mission and why, for instance, the Guard is being tasked to go and help support this facility, and why that's an appropriate use of National Guard soldiers.
So the unit that's there is the 402nd Military Police Battalion. They're a headquarters staff. And so what they're doing at Guantanamo Bay is helping the division staff that's there run the operations. So they're less involved in direct detainee operations, but more about supporting everything. It's a perfect mission for the Guard. It's one we train for. It's one that the soldiers are ready to do. And I will say this, though, Mike, that some may say, well, Cuba's only 90 miles off of Key West, but gone is gone. And so it's a regular deployment, and they'll be busy.
And for almost a year.
It is, for about a year.
And a good sort of bridge to talk a little bit about the challenge of deployment. And Lieutenant Colonel Bain, you've seen this from both sides. You've deployed 3 times, most recently to Iraq and in 2010, but you're also married to a Guard soldier who most recently deployed to Iraq in, I believe, 2005. So talk about it from both sides, that sort of impact, and what's that like?
Well, I always say that the tougher side is probably here on the home front, because your soldier is supposed to be here helping out with things around the house. The soldier is ready to do that mission, goes overseas, and has that one focus on that mission. But there are so many resources that the Nebraska Guard has for families, Military One Source, our Family Programs Office, and all of the family support groups that are here to make it possible to provide that network for those families.
So what do those resources do? What do they provide?
It can be anything from counseling to maybe finding you an electrician, somebody to help mow the yard, trustworthy child care providers. Pretty much the sky's the limit.
So let's talk about both hats that you've worn during a deployment cycle. When you yourself were deployed, what was the hardest thing about it?
The hardest part being deployed would be being away from the family. Children, they grow up awful fast. A year can make a big difference in a child's life.
And then the other side of it, when you're home and your husband was deployed.
It's all the things that you're now wearing both hats, picking those up. And if you're an employed spouse, you still have your job, your commitments, and you're really just picking up all the additional. So you're basically one person doing two people's work.
Okay. We're talking about this cycle of heavy deployments that the Guard was in for quite a while. Are you still seeing some of the impacts, some of the things that happen after the fact, the residual impacts on families and soldiers?
Sure. I think that what we continue to see, and not at a very high level, but is still there, and it's the reason we have directors of psychological health for both the Army and the Air National Guard, can be some post-traumatic stress disorder things or other events that occurred while they were on their combat tours or in combat environments that lead them to maybe be struggling a little bit in coping with life after they return. I think what's really important to recognize is that in most employed or deployed environments, the pace is pretty fast and furious. You're always going, always focused on mission, and then you try to slow that pace down when you come back home. And that's where some of our programs, such as the Yellow Ribbon Reintegration Program that Congress authorized to help reserve component members reintegrate not only back into the Guard or Reserve, but into their communities and families in a supported way that have made a difference.
Give me an example of what some of those reintegration challenges are. What do they look like?
So, well, speaking from personal experience, and maybe Colonel Bain, you'd say the same thing. So when you leave and you're mission focused and your spouse is taking over the things that you used to do, and they figure out maybe a better way of doing it than you did it, and you come back home and you think you're going to just fall back in and assume exactly the same roles and responsibilities, that can be an adjustment. Our folks are pretty strong-willed people, and when they come out of those environments, they have a lot of confidence in their abilities. So that adjustment back can be a challenge sometimes in families.
I've heard, yeah, go ahead.
I'd say one of the things that we always tell families, you'll find a new normal. Because your spouse may have picked up a lot of the extra responsibilities and is very good at it and doesn't want to give it up, as well as you coming back, you're going to kind of ease your way into it. But as a family or as a couple, you're going to find a new normal on how you do business.
I mean, I've heard soldiers in the past tell me it was everything from being upset because they didn't like the way that their child arranged shoes in a closet to being bothered by seeing piles of trash along the side of the road for fear it could be
Absolutely.
something dangerous. Yeah. Did you go through some of that?
Absolutely, or firecrackers or some kind of sound. It can be a traumatic moment. But I think some of that too is because you're in such a high op tempo or high stress environment that maybe sometimes your patience or your for an immediate answer or an immediate action, sometimes that's a little more difficult, having a child that you have to be more patient with.
Yeah. Nationally, there were 123 National Guard soldiers who committed suicide last year. We've seen similar numbers to this for several years, and it's increased significantly after 9/11.
Right.
This has happened in Nebraska. You
Right.
dealt with this in Nebraska National Guard.
We have.
Why is this happening? Talk a little bit about what you're doing about it.
So I'm not sure to be honest, I can answer why. I think, we've unfortunately had some experience with suicides in Nebraska, both Army and Air. I think it's in part people making a choice to think they're going to improve the lives of those they leave behind because maybe, life insurance or remove a problem. Here's the three things we know that play out in these, in every one of these, in some form or fashion. That's either relationship difficulties, substance abuse difficulties, or financial difficulties, and they're often interwoven. So what we try to do with respect to all of that is we have some programs that we run in the National Guard to empower every soldier and every airman to, if they see one of their battle buddies struggling, to do three basic things, which is ask, how you doing? What's going on with you? Care about your fellow soldier, airman, and escort them to help. And that could be to a chaplain, to a director of psychological health, picking up the phone and calling Military One Source and getting some counseling that way. Those are really effective strategies. We see that.
Are the three things that you're talking about, is that exacerbated by a deployment or a post-deployment environment?
I'm not sure about the deployment itself, because it can cause stress in the relationship, obviously. Over in the CENTCOM area of operations, there's very limited access to substance, alcohol and other issues like that. And then financially, it's often a better, you get paid pretty well, plus they get housing and subsistence allowances to help support the family that's back here. It's really, I think, if we see it post-deployment, it's more that adjustment period afterwards. But I will tell you this, that when we look at the rates of suicide for those that have deployed and those that have never deployed, it's not different. That deployment is not a good predictor of that risk.
Is military service a contributor?
I would almost say that, if anything, it's a positive factor for some that might struggle. What we find is the military is where they reach out usually for help, because they know there's resources within the military versus seeking their civilian employer or family members that might not understand. There's folks in the military that they know they have for resources. And as the general said, the indicators as far as the number of suicides that are, have deployed versus haven't deployed, there's not any connection that we can make at this time.
Okay. Other mental health issues that arrive post-deployment, especially again with this cycle of heavy combat deployments?
I would say for those that might have been in environments where they experienced concussions, there is some mild traumatic brain injury effects that we do see sometimes that often get better over time, but you still see some residuals. You can see that manifested with some mild memory and attention and concentration problems, and depression often is present in those cases as well.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about transformation. This is something the Guard's been going through on a national level for, about a year now, I believe. In Nebraska, this impacts about 1,000 Army National Guard soldiers, including the unit that you're the deputy commander of. So what does this mean, and on a practical level, what does this look like for people?
So it provides a lot of additional opportunities within the Army National Guard side. We had a lot of transportation assets, which kind of limited the rotation or the training opportunities and career progression for soldiers. With the Maneuver Enhancement Brigade coming on.
Which is your unit.
Which is,
yeah.
And we provide basically any support that a combat element would need to be able to maneuver on the battlefield. We enhance that capability.
Which means what?
Basically, we're providing route security, route clearing, detection of chemical, biological weapons so they can maneuver throughout the battlefild. Underneath us, we gained an engineer battalion, which is a lot more specialties than we've had in the past. We've also, and these here expand clear west in Nebraska, where we used to have just a lot of transportation far west. We've gained some MP units out west. We're gaining a cyber unit in the Nebraska Guard, and our military police just is transforming from a detainee operations to combat MP battalion, which basically means that they're going to be doing route security, C2 for combat companies.
So on a broader level, what essentially you're doing for about a fourth of, or maybe even a little more of the Army side, is you're saying we're going to change your jobs.
We are. It does mean a change, but what it means is that a soldier entering into a particular branch or career field within the Army can stay in that career field throughout their career probably, whereas before they might have had to change about mid-career point and go yet to another school and retrain. So that's one of the big positives, that an enlisted soldier can stay all the way to the most senior ranks, and an officer can stay to actually senior field grade officer ranks as well in that same career.
Is there a little bit of chaos with this?
There always is. There's often, but I will say this, there's a lot of goodness in this way. So for example, the military police combat unit we stationed out in Chadron, Scottsbluff, and Grand Island is already full. And so it's clear that people want that opportunity and a change. And we've increased the amount of military diversity we have in the state in terms of jobs. And that, I think, is proving to be a success. And that,
in the past, if you had somebody in Chadron that wanted to do that, they might have had to drive to Grand Island.
That's correct.
They would have.
So some of this is a practical.
That's right. That's right.
From visiting with soldiers, most of them are telling me it's an energizing kind of opportunity to seek other career fields, knowing that there's career progression. If they want to, they can stay in the same career field, from the beginning of entry to their retirement if they want to.
Okay. Major General Daryl Bohack, Lieutenant Colonel Jan Bain, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, here are some of the stories that my colleagues at NET News have been working on. Ben Bohal looked at how Nebraska teachers are trying to find creative ways to get their students out into nature. It's part of a larger push to get kids interested in natural sciences by learning more about our state's wildlife. And Nebraska now has 2 special courts designed to help veterans charged with nonviolent crimes get the help they need without jail time. Bill Kelly visits with a judge and some veterans who are grateful for a second chance. That story next week. You can listen to or read all of our signature stories at netnebraska.org/news and connect with NET News and our journalists on Facebook and Twitter. The 2017 session of the Nebraska legislature is over, actually a few days earlier than scheduled. It was a contentious 86 days of business. On the last day, Governor Pete Ricketts praised senators for their budget work.
We demonstrated Nebraska grit by coming together to prioritize the funding for K-12 schools, property tax relief, corrections reform, and making the tough decisions so that we can maintain that 3% balance, get a budget together on time, and not every state can say they do that, and do that all without raising taxes.
All right, state government reporter Fred Knapp joins us now. Let's start by talking about what the governor said and didn't say in that short speech to lawmakers.
Well, in addition to praising them for their work on the budget, he also talked about things like a workforce housing initiative that is going to transfer $7 million from an existing affordable housing trust fund to primarily rural areas where there are companies that want to expand, but there's not suitable housing to house the workforce that they want to attract. He also talked about things like occupational licensing reform, making it easier to transfer credentials from other states. If they want a license to be a cosmetologist or an audiologist can now sell hearing aids, that sort of thing. But there were some things that he didn't mention as well. The reserve requirement, which he talked about in that clip, the 3%, was achieved only at the expense of his veto of more than $32 million in the rates that are paid to providers of services in nursing homes or for folks with developmental disabilities. And prisons, the overcrowding problem remains. He had asked for 135 more protective services workers over 2 years. The legislature stretched that out to 3 years under the reasoning that there are already about 140 vacant positions that they can't fill, so they have to fill those before they create new positions.
So there'll be some things that'll carry over into next year, into 2018. What are some of those things?
Well, there's a slew of them. There's medical marijuana, for example, that was debated once, but because the sponsor, Senator Anna Wishart, couldn't show that she had a path to overcoming a filibuster, it was taken off the agenda. Same thing with an anti-discrimination measure against LGBT people. And of course, the big thing hanging out there is property tax, which was said to be the priority issue going in, and it combined with income tax reform that the governor wanted just didn't get done.
Well, and there's a group of senators that were pushing for it during the session that are actually looking at taking their own measure possibly outside of the State House and getting that on a ballot. Talk about that.
That's right. A group of 10 mostly rural senators led by Senator Steve Erdman from Bayard out there by Chimney Rock he's going to introduce a constitutional amendment yet to be written next year, and there are two ways for things to get on the ballot for voters to decide. There's the legislative route, and he says if he can't get this constitutional amendment approved for the ballot through the legislature, then he'll pursue an initiative petition drive. Of course, the big question is, if you want to lower property taxes, are you going to replace them by something else, shift, or are you aiming for an overall cut? And if you're aiming for an overall cut, that has the biggest effect on the biggest user of property taxes, which is schools.
And if you get another year like this where things are tight?
If there's no money, there's no money.
Yeah. And it was interesting to watch some of the commentary that was happening as the session wrapped up. You know, Ernie Chambers, who's obviously not a fan of Governor Ricketts, called the session a moral disaster and the worst of his 40 years in office. Lincoln Journal-Star reporter Zach Bluhacek asked lawmakers to describe the session in one word, and he got a lot of things like frustrating, incomplete, disappointing, painful. You've covered the legislature for a long time. Was this that different a year?
Well, there's always a certain amount of angst, you know, especially towards the end of the session when they run out of time, they run out of money. And so there's always a certain amount of wailing and gnashing of teeth. But it did feel different. It felt like creeping Washingtonitis had finally made its way to Nebraska in terms of partisanship and paralysis. So yeah, it did feel different.
And we'll coin that term, or maybe copyright the term, creeping Washingtonitis for you. So Fred, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. The Kansas-Nebraska Act helped create our state, but it also had a profound impact on our nation. That story is this week's Nebraska 150 moment.
Originally known as a bill to create the Nebraska and Kansas territories, the Nebraska-Kansas Act of 1854 was introduced to create the territories and open them up to settlement. Introduced by Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas as a means to ensure a northern transcontinental railroad route, it allowed people in the territories of Nebraska and Kansas to decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery. Later, after several battles in the Kansas Territory over the abolition of slavery, deeming it Bloody Kansas, historians changed the name to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The result of the aftermath was the establishment of the Republican Party and eventually, together with several incidents across the country, culminated in the Civil War.
Well, that's all for this edition of Speaking of Nebraska. Next week, we'll talk about the issue of hunger in our state. Thanks for joining us. Good night.